Russia is quietly cannibalizing its own fleet just to stay airborne. Here is the truth behind the sudden collapse.
Ukraine. Russia's Aerospace Forces, or VKS, fielded roughly 780 tactical combat aircraft, compared to Ukraine's roughly 125. That was still a 5-to-1 advantage in raw numbers, backed by what was supposed to be one of the world's air superiority over Ukraine in the war's opening weeks, but both its military and civilian aviation industries are now careening toward what experts are calling an inevitable collapse. And according to recent analyses, that collapse could become undeniable. Military think tanks, intelligence agencies, and industry analysts point to the same alarming conclusion. Russia's new ones, and even the skilled workers needed to keep existing planes in the air. Russia went from supposed aerial supremacy to catastrophe in less than 4 years. In November 2025, the Royal United Services Institute published a comprehensive analysis that sent shockwaves through defense circles. Titled Vulnerabilities in Sukhoi Production, Clipping Russia's Wings, the report laid bare just how fragile Russia's military aircraft manufacturing has become. Starting with the pure numbers, Russia produced just 9 Su-34 fighter bombers in 2022, then 13 in 2023 in Su-35s, but deliveries have been unevenly distributed, suggesting significant delays. Putting that in perspective, 41 Su-34Ms and up to 8 Su-35s visually until October 2025. Rand Corporation's 2024 assessment found that Russia was effectively losing 26 aircraft per year from overbind. So the country's barely replacing what it's losing, let alone expanding its fleet. But the real crisis is in what's causing the lower production. Depends heavily on foreign components, machine tools, and specialized equipment scattered across a complex supply chain. And depends on imports from Germany, France, Japan, Taiwan, Italy, Sweden, South Korea, and the United States. Take the example of the Karachevsky Zavod Electro Detail, or KZE, which is a critical node in Russia's supply chain that major military industrial manufacturers, including aviation, air defense, and missile manufacturers such as Almaz Antey and OAC, its exquisite Japanese-made Sodic electrical discharge machining tools. But Japan banned the export of all CNC machines to Russia in April 2023. And expanded these restrictions in February 2024. That means within the next couple of years. Then there's the brain drain. The median age of military manufacturing employees in Russia was 45 years in 2021, with only 16% under 29. Take Professor Yuri Yukhanov of South Federal University, who's a leading scholar in antenna, completed his PhD in radio engineering and software at the same university, and then promptly emigrated to the United States in 2007, where he now works as a principal software engineer at Meta. This pattern repeats across Russia's aerospace sector. The bulk of the talent is the old Soviet Guard, booming industry to gain long-term employment. But young, talented engineers see the writing on the professor makes only about $1,302 per month, with some sources nuking the average and ranking it behind neighbouring Kazakhstan in terms of purchasing power parity, let alone ranging from 160,000 to 400,000 workers and engineers, with the most conservative are needed just to maintain current production levels. Perhaps most damning, the RUSI report notes that Russia has struggled with import substitution in the aviation sector. The results have been mixed at best. In many critical areas, Russia's dependence on foreign-made systems, aviation struggles, its civilian aircraft industry faces an even more spectacular implosion. In 2022, it would procure more than 1,000 new civil aircraft for airlines by 2030. The plan included producing 14 aircraft by the end of 2022, 25 in 2023 and 69 in 2024. And production targets were slashed from 171 aircraft for 2024-2025 to merely 21 units, and even those revised targets are being cut again due to financing challenges. The situation became so dire that in 2020, due to ongoing delays and manufacturing challenges, The reason for this is quite simple. Sanctions have essentially strangled the industry. Russia's civilian fleet consists of over 700 aircraft, predominantly Airbus and Boeing models, with Western sanctions blocking access now depend on complex, indirect grey market import routes to source critical components. The consequences are already visible in the skies, or rather, increasingly on the ground. Up to 30 airlines stated in late 2020 of Russia's passenger transportation. That's a quarter of the fleet grounded, with the rest needing to take up the slack. And the other companies aren't much better off. Small businesses are the latest in line, for a time until we see the big sharks get taxed just a bit more to compensate again. The production problems mirror those in the military sector. Even when Russia, they rely heavily on Western components, most notably the Franco-Russian powers and key avionics modules. Experts now warn that without access to new Western parts, the superjet fleet is still facing mounting reliability issues. 4.6 engines, allowing the aircraft to remain in service until roughly 2028-2029, while Moscow evaluates a possible re-engineering with the PD-8. First, both sectors are subsidiary airliners, from IL-76 military transports to MC-21 commercial jets. When OAC announced it wanted to boost Sukhoi fighter jet production, plans to fire 1,500 management staff. So it was essentially transferring management and budgets from one bucket to another. Second, they cannibalize each other for parts and supply chains, and technologies that go into planes aren't neatly divided between military and civilian. Russian industry has been caught using parts intended for civilian aircraft to keep military jets flying and vice versa. The machine tools at KZE that we mentioned earlier, they do both. Third, when factories shut craft parts simultaneously. This puts enormous strain on already limited resources. A metallurgy plant can't easily switch between producing titanium alloys for Su-35 airframes and commercial airliners. But increasingly, that's exactly what Russia is demanding. And when the Russian government demands a contract, it either gets the contract or the management faces criminal charges and jail time for failing to meet it. But there's also another theory. The other, then reversing course months later. The logic is simple. Russia needs civilian aviation to maintain internal connectivity across its vast territory, continue the war in Ukraine, and maintain its strategic deterrent. When resources become scarce to maintain both adequately, Russian planners apparently believe they can juggle priorities, boosting military production for a critical offensive a year down the line, then pivoting back to civilian production when domestic air travel becomes too dysfunctional. But this approach is failing on both fronts. UMPO plant in Ufa produces engines for Sukhoi military aircraft, but the same region's universities and technical schools also train engineers for civilian aviation. When young engineers emigrate to flee conscription, both sectors suffer. When the Aviastar aircraft plant in Ulyanovsk similarly faced a workforce deficit of 2,500 workers in January 2024. By April 2024, that deficit had grown to 3,500. This plant produces both military transport aircraft. Russia needs to be careful on how it's using the existing fleet, which is where the problems only start piling on. Russian military aviation doctrine, as outlined in reports from the French Institute for International Relations, never envisioned widespread sustained air dominance operations to soften them before ground assaults. This doctrine worked reasonably well for brief conflicts in Georgia, Crimea, and continued far longer than Russian planners predicted, and these aircraft are accumulating dangerous flight hours. As the RAND Corporation reported in March 2024, the Russian Air Force was flying at less than 75% of its pre-war capacity. Initially, Russian forces flew over 150 sorties per day. Those hours dramatically increases failure risk and reduces future operational availability. The majority of VKS fighters operating over Ukraine are the new aircraft, but according to RAND, slightly more than half of VKS's tactical airframes overall are more than 30 years old, largely older Su-27s, the older MiG-31s and Su-27s. With an estimated average remaining airframe life of less than 20% and 35% respectively, these older aircraft simply don't have enough hours left for sustained combat operations. Russia's air-to-air MiG-29s are totally absent from the conflict, even from air patrollable, or are being kept in reserve for some hypothetical fight actively useless. Russia's response to this crisis has been to radically transform how it uses aircraft. Enter the glide bomb revolution. Starting in 2023, Russia began mass-producing UMPK glide bomb kits. Essentially, Fab 500 to the massive Fab 3000 can glide up to 40 miles after being released, allowing Russian aircraft to attack from well behind their own Ukrainian air defenses at close range. Russian pilots could now launch glide bombs from standoff distances and immediately turn back to safety. This dramatically reduced aircraft losses while maintaining or even increasing their destructive firepower against Ukrainian pilots in July and 4,390 in August. Production of UMPK kits rose from several thousand in 2023 to 40,000 in 2024, with a target of 70,000 for 2025. Transit to the launch zone, weapons release, and return to base. The aircraft still accumulate some wear and tear. Russia has essentially created a tactical adaptation mass, but doesn't solve the strategic problem of airframe exhaustion. It's flying marginally safer missions, but still running out of planes. Ukraine has also, while Russian jets can deliver these weapons from relative safety, the UMPK guidance kits themselves require specialized manufacturing. The Kometa series of jam-resistant GNSS navigation modules in Moscow are critical components installed in both the Shahed drones flying daily toward Ukraine and the glide bombs decimating Moscow-based GNPP region, and on the precision components from companies like KZE that we discussed earlier. The supply chain, while distributed, has identifiable choke points and capability to strike deep into Russian territory. Operation Spiderweb in June reportedly damaged or destroyed 41 military aircraft. Strikes have evolved from experimental nuisance raids to systematic targeting of Russia's military-industrial complex. If Ukraine can sustain strikes against glide bomb production facilities, the effect of 1,000 glide bombs monthly, even a 30 to 40% reduction in production, would significantly degrade Russian offensive capabilities in critical sectors up to 450 glide bombs per week. But there's a dilemma for Ukraine. Every drone aimed at glide bomb factories is a drone not aimed at oil refineries, forced a VAT hike, and driven Moscow to rapidly redistribute social programs toward military-industrial complexes. Russian economist Vladislav Inozemtsev described oil strikes as the most efficient thing Ukraine can do to hurt Russia's widening defensive positions that took months to construct. They're forcing Ukrainian units into open fields where they become easier targets. As analysts Nikolai Stykov and Jack Watling wrote in their Rusi report, because of the number of precision knock-on impact in suppressing the acceleration of aircraft production. This principle applies equally to glide bomb production. A few successful strikes on the right Ukrainian defenses could stabilize, counterattack, and reshape the battlefield dynamic. The trade-off is clear but agonizing. Striking glide bomb production might save lives and positions in 2025. Every strategic decision requires choosing between short-term tactical relief and long-term strategic victory. But Ukraine is far from the only external force that can. For decades, Russia was a significant force in global arms exports, particularly in combat aircraft aimed at the Russian jets offered a compelling value proposition, platforms at a fraction of Western prices, with relatively simple maintenance requirements. Countries from India to Algeria, but China has emerged as the decisive threat to Russia's aerospace export dominance. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, China procured multiple batches of Su-30M KK fighters. They struggled to develop their own jet engines and were eager customers. Today, China produces the J-20 stealth fighter, a fifth-generation aircraft that is significantly more capable than Russia's Su-57. China's aerospace industry has not only caught up to Russia in many areas, competitive prices, it's sending out Chinese fighters as potential future purchases. The fifth-generation J-20 and its successor, the J-35, are also approaching serial production, with the J-35 being particularly notable as a potential Western analogue and a clear step beyond Russia's aging designs. The war in Ukraine has also accelerated this shift by exposing the weaknesses of Russian equipment in real combat conditions. Countries watching Ukrainian drones systematically destroy Russian tanks and shoot down Russian aircraft are drawing obvious conclusions about the vulnerability of Russian military hardware. India, after observing the performance gap between Western systems, New Delhi chose the French Rafale over the Russian Su-57s. Egypt, which operates both Rafale and Su-35 aircraft, concluded through competitive testing that the French fighter is significantly more capable. Even more damage, flatlining. That second point is supported by the Jamestown Foundation, which stated that Russia's arms exports collapsed by 24. Moscow has redirected virtually all production to its own military needs, since it's unable to simultaneously sustain the Ukraine war and meet export commitments. The few countries still interested in Russian aircraft face a sobering reality. Russia's generation fighter has barely been deployed even in Ukraine. Fleet has been eager to obtain Su-35s as part of its burgeoning defense cooperation with Russia. And while Iran reportedly received its first Su-35 SE airframes in late 2024, Russia has struggled to deliver the broader fleet Iran expected, following Israel's Operation Rising Lion, which showed that Russian to fill the gaps Moscow couldn't. The long-term implications are also problematic. Several countries across Africa and Southeast Asia operate Soviet aircraft that are reaching the end of their service lives. Many face elevated threat environments and need to modernize. Russia was once the obvious craft, or somehow finding the budget for more expensive Western alternatives. For Russia, losing these export markets isn't just about systems. Without export income, Russia's ability to innovate and compete technologically will further deteriorate. It's a feedback loop. Poor lost customers mean less R&D funding, and less R&D means even worse performance in the next generation of aircraft. When you step back and look at the totality of Russia's aviation crisis, what emerges is a picture of multiple, mutually reinforcing failures, an assessment that Russia will run out of tanks to fuel its operations by 2026. But that assessment could very well apply to there are tens of thousands of Soviet-era units and minimally refurbished. Aircraft require precision maintenance, regular inspections, and replacement of MiG out of a warehouse and expected to fly combat missions. If Ukraine can maintain and expand its deep strike campaign, option 1. Continue trying to sustain both military and civilian aviation at reduced capacity, watching both force wholesale grounding of fleets. Option 2. Abandon civilian aviation entirely, cannibalizing every possible resource, internal air connectivity, and signal economic disaster to the population. Option 3. Abandon military aviation before the entire industry implodes. This would essentially concede the ability to continue offensive operations in Ukraine. All of these are variations of strategic defeat. The most likely outcome choose any single option, but instead drifts between all three, making ad hoc decisions as crisis conditions dictate. The result would be a slow-motion collapse playing out across 2026, idle for weeks or months, and steadily declining sortie rates in Ukraine.
Thanks for watching. Now, to understand how Ukraine has managed to systematically degrade Russia's military capabilities across multiple domains,